So a few words about PSC. So PSC is almost 25 years old at this point. We are headquartered in Chicago. We have an office in Kansas City, and we have an office in downtown Chicago. We're about 100 people, and most people know PSC, or at least most people in this audience know about PSC because of the work that we do in the IBM space. But we actually have skills and capabilities in a lot of different areas. IBM is kind of the one that we're here doing. We also, my practice is also responsible for Salesforce work, where we focus mostly on custom application development with Force.com and integration work with Salesforce's platform. We also do quite a bit of Microsoft work, from infrastructure work, messaging work, .NET, SharePoint, and we're President's Club with Microsoft Dynamics. So why is that important? The perspective that we bring, obviously, for this conference is about IBM technology specifically, but our expertise and our scope is across more than just this single technology. So for instance, one of the big focuses that we have at PSC is about application modernization, which is clearly what people in the node space are typically paying attention to. Taking applications that have served the business for a long number of years, but are now at the point where they need to be modernized and brought current with today's technologies. So we do that not only in the IBM space, but we take a holistic view of application modernization and look at it as its complete impact, not just for the application itself, but what does that do for your network, what does it do for your data centers, what does it do, complete impact. And it's not just Nodes applications, Rackspace's applications, it's any application that's being modernized either onto a new platform or the same platform and updating its skills and capabilities. We are heavily invested in IBM. We have 5 IBM champions at PSC. Mark is speaking this week, I'm speaking this week, John's speaking this week, and Kathy and Brad are not here. So we're the only company in the world to have 5 IBM champions in the ICS brand that I know of. I've not heard any other company. So clearly we're heavily invested in the space. We'll get some good sessions coming up this week. So what I want to talk about first is what this is not going to be. Like I told you before, the session that we had before where Nathan was talking about server-side JavaScript specifically and why it's something you don't want to invest in. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I am going to talk about today is why each of them might be a good investment in terms of technology. What are you going to get if you invest in JavaScript in general? What are you going to get if you invest in Java in particular? I'm also not going to make a proclamation for which is better, because frankly, it's too hard to say this one's better than this one. Well, in what context is this one better than this one? What if you're an end user? What if you're a developer? What if you're managing a development team? Each of those has different implications, so there isn't an answer that says that one is the best one, and if you're doing this, you're doing it completely wrong. Part of the reason why we're having, I wanted to do this session is because Mark who's on my team, wrote a blog post about this topic, and it sparked a whole bunch of conversation and debate, which I view as a healthy thing. And so this isn't trying to settle that conversation or anything like that, but hopefully what it is an opportunity to educate and be able to give some opinions as to what you might be able to get from one platform or another. So let's start with then what we can agree upon. I think what we can agree upon, I hope we can agree upon, is that both are important. If your goal is to develop, cutting edge, elegant, modern applications, both of these are important in the context of Rackspace, right? If you are not using Java, there's certain things you're not able to do, or you're not able to do as well as if you were using JavaScript. And where possible, my opinion is that people should be proficient with both. Sometimes that's not completely possible. Some people come from a particular background that makes one of them easier to grasp or another easier to grasp. So I wouldn't say that it should always be the goal that every single person should be capable of doing JavaScript, whether it be server-side or client-side, at the highest degree, nor Java. But I would agree that being proficient in both should be a goal of most developers. So when you're evaluating what the strengths or weaknesses of them are, then you have to look at from what perspective are you coming from. So I've selected kind of 3 different angles that you can come from. If you're standing in the position of an end user, what do you care about? If you're standing in the position of a developer, what do you care about? If you're standing in the position of management, what do you care about? And then how do you apply those to each of these technologies to make some decisions and figure out which one you ultimately want to invest in. So I would guess that, does anyone here not know that you can use Java and JavaScript to build X-based applications? Everybody's aware of that, right? This isn't a deep, deep technical nuts and bolts, here's how you do all this sort of stuff. So essentially, Java and JavaScript are ultimately not apples to apples comparison, right? Where they do collide, or where they do provide opportunities to compete with each other, would be on the server side. So JavaScript, you can write server-side JavaScript. In the same case, you can write your business logic, typically with Java as well. JavaScript also provides a whole additional set of capabilities that are typically on the client side, not on the server side, so it's not an exact comparison. So I'm going to talk about JavaScript in both the context of server-side JavaScript as well as client-side JavaScript, and then in terms of Java, primarily used for the core business logic, which is server-side. So the first point is, if you're an end user and you're sitting in that seat and you say, well, which do I care about, Java or JavaScript? Frankly, they don't care about whether you're writing Java or JavaScript. We at PSC, when we go sit down with customers and we talk about what we're going to build for them, we don't talk about the technology necessarily. Our company is a solutions provider that happens to do that with technology. If we're not focused on the business problem, if we're not fixing business problems, then it doesn't really matter what technology we're using on the back end. Ultimately, all of us, whether you're a developer or an end user or management, should be focused primarily on fixing business problems. If you can fix those business problems with server-side JavaScript and Java, okay, well then you need to take it a level deeper. But what I find sometimes in the technical audience in particular is we get so caught up in, well, Java does this better, and so you've got to use it in every instance, and it's the only solution, or JavaScript is this, and it does also this sort of thing, that we take our eye off the ball of what ultimately matters. And what ultimately matters is, does it work for the user? For instance, when was the last time you went to a website like Facebook or some other relevant website and said, man, I sure hope this is written in Java. It'd be so awesome if the back end of this thing was written in Java, right? Nobody cares. You shouldn't care. It doesn't really matter. So when talking to our end users, or for us, our customers, ultimately what we have to understand is, what is the business problem? What is the pain point that we're trying to solve for the customer? And then architect a solution that may involve many different technologies to be able to ensure that we're actually meeting that business problem or that solution. So frankly, technology is irrelevant from an end user standpoint. Clearly from a technologist standpoint it's not, but from an end user standpoint it's not that important. So you get into one of those arguments about, well, you should never do this and you don't always want to do this. Well, reframe that in your mind in terms of, what are we trying to accomplish, what's the business goal, what are we trying to do, and then have that conversation after that. So the way I view it is that all time is an investment that comes at the cost of something else that you could be doing. Therefore, don't waste your time. So every moment that you spend learning JavaScript, you're not learning Java. Every moment that you're learning Java, you're not learning JavaScript, and vice versa, right? So the question isn't, do I learn one or do I learn the other, right? I gotta learn Java or I gotta not learn Java. The question is, what are you choosing to put above the other one, right? If I choose to learn JavaScript today, is that a good investment of time, or should I spend those hours or days or weeks or whatever turning around and saying, I could have done that to learn JavaScript or server-side JavaScript or some other capability? So the question then that we kind of need to answer is, what is it that we should invest in? So from a developer standpoint, then where should I spend my time? What's a good use of my time and effort? So this slide, you guys have probably seen a variation of this in various other presentations, but this slide essentially just steps back and says, okay, well, if I'm going to invest my time in a technology, are either Java or JavaScript good places to spend that time based on the popularity or languages? So this is courtesy of a website called Lightbox. I would encourage you to go take a look at it because it's pretty interesting. They basically take a whole bunch of different ways you could measure the popularity of a language, and they try to chart all those, and then they try and normalize all these different methods for figuring out what's important or what's relevant, and then kind of normalize them down to this comparison. So if you ask the question, what's the most popular language in the world, this attempts to answer that question. So interestingly, C is first, Java is second, PHP, and then JavaScript, right? So if you're spending time and effort in either of these technologies to learn Java or JavaScript, I think that you can see from this that you're not wasting your time. If you're doing X pages today, but your management decides tomorrow that you're going to do something else, either of these are areas that you can invest your time in, and ultimately it's not going to be wasting time. So what type of development you do is also relevant. So I thought this was an interesting diagram. This is from Stephen Wiesel. Is that how you say his last name? Wiesel? So what this chart is depicting is who you are as a developer, and therefore, in my opinion, has a direct correlation to your needs in terms of Java capabilities. So if we look at the bottom of this chart and we look at the yellow circle, develop X pages, that's Mark Donnelly, Tony McGuckin, people who are writing the core of X pages, right? They're developing X pages as a runtime for all of us to be able to use otherwise. If you look up to the green circle for develop for X pages, that's a red pill, or companies that are building plugins on top of the architecture and essentially are trying to do integration or plugins and things like that. And then if you move up to the top circle, which I would argue is probably most of us, it's develop with X pages. So this is most developers who just fire up the server and have to go build an application and want to figure out what to do with it. As you go from the top of this down to the bottom of this, I would argue that Java is almost imperative at this point and is optional, perhaps recommended as you go up that scale. So the way that he looked at it is technology-driven versus business-driven, and I would agree with the way that he's put it. Technology-wise, they're not developing X pages, the core of X pages, and adding capabilities to it with server-side JavaScript or client-side JavaScript. Even in that middle layer, right, Nathan's got very strong opinions about what Java is. Well, that makes sense for where he lives. He lives here all day long. Most of us live up there all day long. So the relevance of Java changes based on who you are and what type of development work you're actually trying to do. So to attempt to play devil's advocate a little bit, why would you say, okay, my investment should be in Java first over JavaScript, right? Why should I pour my time and energy of either myself or my team into Java over JavaScript? I'd say one big part of it is that if you are invested in JavaScript or server-side JavaScript in the Xpages world, that buys you 0 in the rest of the XCS portfolio. So if you want to take the skill set that you currently have in server-side JavaScript and you want to transplant that and say, okay, now I'm going to do connections development, or now I'm going to do digital experience suite development. Well, if you're not Java capable, you're really not walking into that with anything. You don't come to the table with a whole lot of skills and capabilities that let you start programming on another platform. And there really isn't another product in the ICS portfolio that has server-side JavaScript capabilities that you're able to take and port your skills from server-side JavaScript over to the other products in the portfolio. The other thing is, as I said in the previous slide, as you get closer to that core, if you start building plugins and you start getting closer and closer to the core, then Java is ultimately going to do, because Java does things that server-side JavaScript can't. It allows you capabilities and skills or opportunities that you can't get with server-side JavaScript. So for instance, a good example of that is Poi, right? Poi is a Java library that allows you to create Excel spreadsheets, Word documents, PowerPoint files, and so forth. That's something that's done in Java, exclusively in Java. You could write server-side JavaScript to access Java, to interact with that library, but ultimately, if you're programming at the Java level and not server-side JavaScript, you're able to do and utilize capabilities with that. And if you look at that example, there's tons of other libraries. I mean, an unimaginable amount of other opportunities to be able to extend your development portfolio as well. So Poi is one example of it, but there's 50 other variations like that. So writing Java allows you to kind of open the world of opportunities for other libraries and skills that you wouldn't necessarily be able to have in server-side JavaScript. In addition, the style of programming, so Java is an object-oriented programming language. So I think in the previous thing, people asked about who wrote classes in load scripts. Like, do you guys still write load script? And if so, do you write it in classes, or have you wrote it in classes? right? So LotusScript is typically a procedural language, right? You're not necessarily always writing a class and putting all your logic in class. I would argue that that's a better way to do it, right? And if that's the case, Java enforces the fact that you're going to write it that way because all logic is ultimately contained inside of an object. That being the case, I think it forces you or puts you down the path automatically of being able to have better reuse, better ability to port one set of application from one application for one thing that you're building and stick it into another. And then ultimately, I think if you're doing that, we also have more maintainability across applications. Now, many people would argue, and I'm looking at one who would argue that you can do a lot of that with JavaScript as well, right? You can write object-oriented, maybe it's a little bit abstract, but you can do that. That's exactly right. Just like when you're writing LotusScript, you can write it in classes, right? But you can't use polymorphism, right? You can't use inheritance really in LotusScript. So all those things, you have challenges if you're going to do that in JavaScript. So yes, you can do much, much better, but ultimately I think that Java forces you into a style of programming that leads to better reusability, better maintainability. And then one other point I have on here about code separation. When you look at the source panel in XPages, you've got all that XML markup that essentially represents your UI, your user interface for the client. When you write procedurally with server-side JavaScript or whatever, you end up mixing and mashing together logic and user interface. I think that Java does a better job or forces you down the path of essentially separating those two concerns. The user experience and then ultimately the business logic are naturally decoupled from each other, and then using expression language, you're able to essentially manage those objects. And I think it pushes you down the path of separation up front. Again, can you do that in server-side JavaScript? Yes, you can. That will help make it more maintainable. You can do all those sorts of things. I think that Java, though, kind of forces you down that path, and it makes you, or it doesn't necessarily make you, but it certainly helps you down that path if you're doing it the right way. So I talked a little bit about Poi and kind of the world of opportunities that open up to you when you start using Java. Little plug for Toby here from PSC. He's going to be talking about using hibernate with XPages, which is, again, one of those Java capabilities that's kind of opened up to you when you go down a level and start programming in Java. So that's Friday at 11:30 if you're interested. So then why perhaps JavaScript over Java? What we're finding at PSC is that beautiful and elegant user experiences do a lot more for our customers in terms of their satisfaction than anything else that we can do, right? Classic XPages development, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. Actually, let me flip there now. So classic XPages development is this, which you're probably all familiar with, right? You got a control over there, you grab your control, you drag and drop that, you stick it on an X page, you set a couple properties, and you essentially display your page. There's nothing wrong with that. That style of programming essentially means you don't really have to know a whole lot about client-side JavaScript because you're essentially stringing together components on the server side to build your interface. There's nothing wrong with that. That works. That's typically where people who are starting with XPages begin because it's provided for you out of the box. And so a lot of people walk into it thinking, well, that must be what I'm supposed to do because why would I have this entire palette of tools if I'm not supposed to go use them? The perhaps negative side of that is that ultimately you end up with user experiences that look something like this, right? They're not ugly, they're not bad, right? One UI you can make look pretty good, right? You can style it with CSS and do all that sort of stuff. But ultimately that style of programming where you're using the components provided to you by IBM means that your user experience looks something like this, right? This is an out-of-the-box view control that's got your pager and so forth. It works, it's functional. It probably meets the business needs, which is the number one thing. But would you rather have something like that, or would you rather have something like this? Right? If you walk up to your user and you're trying to meet their needs, and you provide them the kind of last screenshot, or you provide them this screenshot, which do you think they would prefer to have if they were accomplishing the same goal? I would bet that this is probably where they'll be happier. What this is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? The entire user experience is constructed from those three technologies. The investment in those technologies allows you to kind of escape from a normal-looking XPages interface to something that's much more beautiful. Because essentially, what you're creating is what I like to say, XPages is a first-class web development platform with benefits, right? What I mean by with benefits is if somebody needs to disconnect that thing, work on it well remotely, on the road, replicate it back up to the server. There's not other modern web development platforms that do it anywhere near as well as XPages does. But XPages can also be a first-class web development platform. It can be as good as, name it, right? PHP for custom web development. So really, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, the investment that you make in learning and understanding JavaScript and web technologies allows you to essentially develop differently. So you get web interfaces with that, or potentially web interfaces that look like this. So this is one of our applications. This entire screen doesn't use one component from XPages, I don't think. Am I right, Mark? I don't think there's one of those where you drag and drop it onto the page. So we're essentially free to build any user experience and interface that the client wants to. I'll talk a little bit more about this in terms of what the requirements were and what it ends up with, but we're able to build user experiences and not be confined by the controls that are provided to us from IBM and be able to essentially build whatever we want. So what does that look like when we do it? Ultimately, we are decoupling the front end and back end. Nathan, if you were in that session, talked about REST services. REST services and this style of programming essentially decouples the front end from the back end. So our user interface built in these technologies uses AJAX calls, which are REST calls, to the REST API on the Domino server, and then essentially we've decoupled those two parts. So that means we can build whatever we want on the front end, and then tie that to the back end using REST service calls as we see fit. The other benefit that this style of programming has is the last user interface that I showed you was built by a specific UX design resource on our team. She's not an expert on XPages. She's not an expert on the IBM portfolio or platform. She built that user experience 100% separate from our developers and was able to build the UI via HTML. Bootstrap was used for responsiveness, and cascading style sheets and JavaScript to add the user experience logic. She was able to build all of that without any knowledge of the back end because we essentially decoupled the back end right here. So she was able to focus on what she cared about focusing on. We were able to care about the server-side logic, and we were able to build the best application possible because she didn't need to know what controls, how they were styled, any of those sorts of things. So it aids in your ability to create beautiful interfaces by decoupling the front end and back end. Another relevant, factor in the investment in JavaScript is the rise of JavaScript MVC frameworks. So these are the three most popular JavaScript MVC frameworks: Angular.js, Ember.js, and Backbone.js. These are the three most popular frameworks. These frameworks essentially allow you to build what I just showed you on the last screen more easily than you would be able to if you were hand coding all the capabilities and so forth. So you're able to build very dynamic, very interactive web pages on the client side using these capabilities, and do it faster than if you had to code those things yourself. Another thing, so if you're interested more in nuts and bolts, right? Okay, well that sounds all really good, but how do I do that with Angular or these other libraries? Mark is going to be talking Friday at 3 about Angular and XPages, and then it'll go into a lot more detail of what I'm talking about how you actually are going to use Angular.js. So again, if you look at that as a developer and you say, well, that sounds really good, but how do I know if that's a good investment of time, right? If I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do something else. So I thought these were pretty interesting. So does anybody know what Indeed.com? Have you guys gone to Indeed.com? It's basically a job board aggregation. So it takes individual companies who have public-facing job boards that say, careers, come work here, and they have a whole bunch of job postings. It takes those along with job boards, and it aggregates those jobs you can also, they have a little bit of analytics built into their site, and you can go and you can essentially type in a term, and you can see how many jobs, you can see the trend of how many mentions of that technology are in job posts. So this is doing that for Angular.js. So what you can see is the demand for Angular.js is essentially vertical. Yeah, so John says it's the #1 technology requested skill set in Chicago. This is Backbone, right, which is one of the other possible popular frameworks, and this one is Ember, right? So clearly the scale is important, but what this is showing is really the trend. Okay, so if you're going to go invest time and energy into this different style, are you investing it in a good place? Is it someplace that you're doing it, or is it 2 months from now or 3 months from now going to not be relevant? Well, I don't know what that's going to do after it goes like this, but right now it's going like this. So ultimately, it's not a bad thing to do. And for interest's sake, here's actually what Java looks like. Remember I talked about the scale here? Many times more requests for Java. But trend-wise, kind of, I don't think this is necessarily a negative that's going down, because there's a lot of factors in it. For completeness sake, I wanted to include that slide as well. So, from a management standpoint, so my job as somebody who runs a technology practice, I have to understand the composite skill set of the teams that I have to be able to deliver a solution. If I've got a set of resources who don't know much about JavaScript, right, who aren't invested in that, but I say it's the way to go, we got to all start using Angular tomorrow, is that a good business decision? Is JavaScript at that point the right decision? Probably not. It depends on the skill sets that you have in your team. One other thing that we're noticing too is Domino as a platform used to be fairly narrow in terms of its sweet spot of what it was, right? It was departmental applications that it was good at, and it was really good at it. I mean, there's nothing that could touch it, right? But its envelope of what it was good for was perhaps this way. When you step into the world of X pages, that envelope goes from about this way to about this way, right? There's still things on either end, highly transactional systems, big data, although maybe Nathan has solved that. that would fall outside of that. Highly relational data probably wouldn't be a good fit, although certainly you could use Hibernate to go to a relational backend if you needed to. So the envelope for which X page is good for is much wider. So what that means is you used to be able to have a single resource, and that single resource probably looked like this. They were a classic notes developer. They were really good at solving business problems, but probably not at solving architectural problems, right? Data problems and structural problems and so forth. They were probably not computer science majors. They probably don't have a good understanding of object-oriented design. If you tell somebody who comes from that background, procedural programmer, tomorrow we're doing everything in Java because it's the only way to go, and if you're not using it, you're not doing anything useful, I think you're doing a disservice not only to that person, but potentially to the team and the ability of the team to meet either your customers' demands, in my case, or your users' demands. So if that's the case, you have to take a look at the aggregate skill set of your team and say, not only can I deliver it, but can I deliver it and then be able to support it when someone calls and says, I want my next features? As a consulting company at PSC, our goal is not to build an application and be the company that maintains it for the next 15 years. We want to define a business problem. We want to build a solution to address it. We want to walk in and address that solution. We want to put the users inside of that organization in a position to be able to take that application and make it successful going forward. We don't want to be the company that you call, a month from now and says, hey, there's a problem, can you come in and fix it? We want the company itself to be able to maintain that application and do it. If that company doesn't have any expertise in Java, well, we've said Java is the answer, it's the only way. It doesn't matter if you're not doing it, you're doing it the wrong way. Are we doing them a service or a disservice if we say you have to use Java? It's the only way, it's the best way. You're not doing anything useful. I don't think that's really doing the customers any sort of service. So the skill set of your team to be able to deliver and support that, as well as the team of people that you're handing it over to, whether that be internal to your company or for us, the company that we're working with, has to be a consideration as part of that process. like I said, the envelope of X pages or Domino skills, or sweet spot of the application is getting wider and wider. So what we're also seeing is that provides the opportunity for specialization as well. Used to be, these people walked in and they sat down with the user, they defined the requirements, they built the application, they coded the solution, they delivered it, they fixed the bugs, they did UAT, they did the documentation, they handed it over, they did the next thing on the next project, right? We have one person who can do everything. Well, as the capabilities of the platform get bigger and bigger, there's also an opportunity for specialization. So your team may have one or two people who are really awesome with Java, and they may have really good front-end developers. Well, using the more client-centric focus, the client-side development focus, you can specialize those people. You can have people writing your Java code on the server side, essentially, enable via REST, and you can have people who are really excellent with JavaScript, CSS, and HTML on the client side, building the best possible solution there, and essentially make those two together using REST service calls and so forth. So let me talk about a few, I guess, specifics that kind of illustrate what we've built for customers and how we kind of constructed those with the constraints that we had. So the first one, this is the screenshot that I showed you before. Let's see if I can. So it's this screenshot. So what this is it's for a very large international services company. What they do is they advise companies when they're doing mergers and acquisitions. So a company comes to them and says, our company wants to acquire another company and they're in the satellite industry, right? What this system allows them to be able to do is type in satellite, type in whether it's in North America, et cetera, and be able to essentially find a couple things. What you really want to be able to do if one of those persons is if one of these partners is going to go sit down about a multi-million-dollar deal, is they want to be able to know, have I done this work before? And if I did this work before, what did I actually learn from it, right? The first part is information, and the second part is knowledge. If I know when I've done it before, that's wonderful, but if I can take away from that also, what did I learn from the process of doing that, that certainly puts someone in a position to be able to walk in and impress a customer and potentially win a multi-million-dollar piece of work. So insights are the knowledge, right? I learned these things by going through this process, and qualifications is when did I actually do this in the past. So this application works in a browser, it works on a tablet, it works all the way down to a phone, because if you think of the requirements, that person's going to walk into a meeting, they want to be able to either whip out their phone while they're in the cab going there and say, tell me about all the work that we've been able to do, or pull out their tablet when they're there across the table from them, type some information and find what they ultimately want. This application we architected using this style. The organization is a very large, very capable organization. They have people who can support applications written in Java, server-side JavaScript, SharePoint.net, and you name it. There's a whole bunch of different platforms they have, because they're a very big company. So we essentially architected a solution that looks like this. The front end is Angular.js. We use REST service calls. Those REST service calls are made to custom Java REST services. So we get all the benefits of having Java on the server side, from usability and code maintainability and so forth. And ultimately, our customer is able to use that, maintain that, support that, and be able to digest essentially what we built for them. Second project that I want to highlight is for a large commercial construction company. So this company essentially builds multi-million-dollar, if not billion-dollar, sometimes hospitals or office buildings, hotels like we're sitting in right now. And they essentially needed to manage the construction project for both internal and external people that are a part of that process. So they have a ton of contractors who come in and paint the walls, fix the drywall, do whatever they have to do. And they have a ton of internal people who are actually building the structures, putting the metal up, and so forth. All those people have to be able to interact and collaborate with each other, ultimately to be able to complete these projects. So what we built for them is a very large X-Pages system that allows all those people from the outside to log in securely and be able to collaborate with people on the inside. The company doesn't have any Java skills internally. Xpages and Domino is their platform. They have people that, kind of like I described, the typical notes background. Those are the people who are going to have to maintain the system going forward. If we were to build something with heavy Java on the back end, they would have to spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out how to support it, let alone be able to extend it and build the next layer of the application and do more with it. So our choice was we relied on server-side JavaScript primarily, and we used out-of-the-box Xpages controls, but we used a custom UI. It wasn't one UI, it wasn't Bootstrap, and we built a custom UI that matched their corporate theme and feel and can be applied over the literally hundreds of instances of these project management sites that they're building. And then lastly, the last example I wanted to show was for a staffing and placement agency. The company basically manages resources and the time that those resources spend. So a company would call them up and say, we need 3 PHP developers to work on this project. They would put ads out, essentially allow those people to apply for the job. They would locate those people, and then the system would track would do their time tracking. So they would say, I work this many hours and so forth in that whole timesheet process. This is their product. This is a product that they put out to the world. They make their money based on this product. The product has been built over 10 to 15 years on what I would call classic Domino development, web development. So it's not Nodes client development because it doesn't have a Nodes client audience. It's classic web development. So the skill set of their internal resources were pretty savvy from a web development sense, but they have no skills in the Xpages world, and they have no Java skills at all as well. So the solution that we built them was using Twitter Bootstrap for responsive design so that it worked well. So that was one of the key capabilities they had. And it was mostly server-side JavaScript with a lot of front-end JavaScript work. So jQuery, front-end JavaScript widgets that essentially were interacting via REST across the back end. So it's kind of, the style that we used was a bit of a hybrid. They were a little more savvy with web development skills, so we could do more on the front end and essentially use REST services calls. But on the back end side, they were not savvy with Java, and therefore our ability to dictate that Java was going to be the language that they're built in didn't make sense for this particular client. So I guess from having said all that, I have a few things that I would say is maybe I wouldn't call them rules, I'd call them advice from having been through this curve a lot. I would say if you're new to Xpages and you're feeling like, wow, there's a lot to learn, personally, having been through this curve quite a bit, I would say to focus on JavaScript before server-side JavaScript and client-side JavaScript. I know some people would disagree, but in all the instances that I've seen, which is a typical Xpages background, the ability to learn server-side JavaScript first and then transition into understanding Java in the future is an easier path, in my opinion, than it is you got to go to Java. That's the only way to go. So my recommendation would be do that. In terms of more and more, I'm seeing the second bullet point, right? I'm a CS major and I'm comfortable with Java. I'm starting to do Xpages stuff. Then I would say invest in JavaScript, not necessarily server-side JavaScript, but JavaScript as a language, capabilities of it, front-end development styles, and so forth. I think would be a good place to invest time and energy. If I'm a long-time Xpages programmer and I'm writing kick-butt applications without a single line of Java, I would say learn Java, right? We've built plenty of systems that have made customers extremely happy while using server-side JavaScript and not a line of Java in it. Anybody who sits in, and I've had multiple people sit across the table from me at conferences and tell me, if you're not doing anything in Java, then you're not writing anything useful, which I think is ridiculous. How many of us have ever written applications way long time ago that used app functions? And we had applications that lived for 10 years and met a business need and were written with app functions. I know a customer right now who has 200 Nodes applications and they have almost no Lotus script in them, and they're 10 to 12 years old, And the business is, yeah, they would like to see them modernized, but they are meeting the business need. So are all those people, was that not worth 10 years of effort? Was that not worth the time they spent on it, right? Because that wasn't the best technology available probably back then, but it met a business need and it accomplished the goal that was ultimately needed and it provided value to the business. So in my opinion, don't let anybody tell you that if you're writing server-side JavaScript, you're not doing anything useful, because we've delivered plenty of projects to customers using server-side JavaScript that were well received and are meeting the business need. But what I would say is, if all you have is a hammer and everything looks like a nail, right? If you don't know anything about Java, then you're going to apply potentially a less elegant solution to something that you're doing than if you perhaps did know what it was. And if you do know what it is, you might just say, well, I don't need the hammer this time, I need a screwdriver this time. But what I would urge you, if you're in the third bucket, is understand what tools are available to you so that you can make the best decision with the technology that you understand at that point in time. And then lastly, if you're coming at it from a web development standpoint, because I see a lot more kind of straight web developers who develop another platform coming to the XPages platform in the style that we talked about. They're really good with user experiences. They're really great with Java. They understand REST services regardless of the platform. If you're coming from that angle, then I would suggest investing in learning Java, getting comfortable with Java, understanding what capabilities and skills are brought to the table with Java. Questions? Good, I got us back on track. Does anybody have any questions on media stuff that I talked about? See, that was very